Hello everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Skies. Here on this channel, I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the stars to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I had been working as a radio technician for nearly 15 years when the incident happened. It was a routine maintenance call, nothing that should have been out of the ordinary. I was sent to check on a remote transmission tower about 40 miles outside the city, the kind of place where cell service cuts out, and the only sounds are wind through the trees and the distant hum of electrical equipment. The tower sat on a small hill surrounded by dense forest. I'd been there before for regular inspections, but something felt different that day. The air was heavier, and the usual sounds of birds and insects were strangely absent. I parked my truck at the base of the access road and gathered my equipment: clipboard, frequency meter, basic tools for checking signal strength and equipment function. As I approached the tower, I noticed the first anomaly. My frequency meter, which normally picked up dozens of radio signals in the area, was showing almost nothing. Just a few weak local stations and some background static. It was like someone had thrown a blanket over all electromagnetic activity in the region. I made a note to check the equipment calibration, but the meter had been working fine during the drive. The tower itself looked normal from the outside. Tall, steel lattice reaching up about 200 feet, with the usual array of antennas and transmitters near the top. I climbed the service ladder to the equipment shed at the base, where most of the sensitive electronics were housed. Everything appeared to be functioning normally. Power indicators showed green. Signal levels were within acceptable ranges. But something nagged at me. I decided to run a full diagnostic on the transmission equipment. That's when things got strange. As I connected my test equipment to the main transmitter array, the readings didn't make sense. The signals were there, but they were different somehow. The frequencies were slightly off. Not enough to cause problems, but enough to notice if you were looking closely. It was like someone had taken a perfectly tuned piano and adjusted every key by just a few cents. Then I heard it. A low, humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't mechanical like the usual electrical hum you'd expect near a radio tower. This was deeper, more resonant, like a tone that bypassed your ears and went straight to your chest. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to permeate the entire area. The frequency meter in my hand started acting erratically. The display flickered between readings that made no sense. Signals appearing and disappearing. Frequencies that shouldn't exist in the civilian radio spectrum. I thought maybe the equipment was malfunctioning, but when I checked my backup meter it showed the same impossible readings. That's when I saw them. Lights in the sky just above the tree line about a quarter-mile away. They weren't aircraft lights, too steady and too bright, and they moved in ways that defied physics, stopping instantly, changing direction without slowing down, hovering motionless, then accelerating to incredible speeds. There were 3 of them, arranged in a perfect triangle, maintaining their formation as they danced through the air. I tried to radio back to the office, but my handheld radio produced only static. Even the emergency frequency was dead. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual for this location, but even the GPS seemed confused, showing my location as somewhere in the middle of the ocean. I was completely cut off from the outside world. The lights moved closer, now hovering directly above the transmission tower. The humming sound intensified, and every piece of electronic equipment around me started behaving strangely. Displays flickered wildly. Frequencies drifted in and out of range, and the main transmitter began cycling through power levels on its own. It was like the entire electromagnetic spectrum was being manipulated by something I couldn't understand. I climbed back up the tower, trying to get a better view of what was happening. The lights were close enough now that I could see they weren't solid objects, but rather areas where the air itself seemed to glow. They pulsed gently, like they were breathing, and as I watched, I realized they were scanning the transmission equipment, methodically moving from antenna to antenna, as if cataloging every piece of technology. The strangest part was the silence. Despite all the electronic chaos around me, the forest had gone completely quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Just the deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I felt like I was inside a bubble, separate from the normal world, watching something that shouldn't exist. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the lights began to move away, ascending slowly until they disappeared above the cloud cover. As soon as they were gone, the humming stopped and all the electronic equipment returned to normal. The frequency meter showed typical readings. My radio crackled back to life, and even my cell phone found a signal again. I completed my inspection as quickly as possible, documenting the normal readings and packing up my equipment. When I got back to the office, I filed a standard maintenance report noting some minor frequency drift that had corrected itself. I didn't mention the lights or the electromagnetic anomalies I'd witnessed. Who would believe such a story? But that night changed how I view my work. Every time I visit a remote transmission site, I find myself watching the sky, looking for signs that we're not alone in our use of the electromagnetic spectrum. Sometimes late at night, when I'm monitoring radio frequencies, I catch signals that don't match any known transmissions. Brief bursts of data on frequencies that should be empty. I've learned to recognize the signs, the subtle shifts in background radiation, the way certain frequencies seem to clear out just before something unusual happens. Most of my colleagues dismiss these anomalies as atmospheric interference or equipment glitches, but I know better. I've seen what can manipulate our technology with ease. The government agencies that monitor the radio spectrum have their explanations for unusual signals. They talk about solar flares and atmospheric ducting. But I've worked with radio equipment long enough to know the difference between natural phenomena and something else. Something that watches our transmissions and perhaps uses our own infrastructure to observe us. Sometimes I wonder if that transmission tower was chosen specifically because of its location. Remote enough to avoid detection, but connected enough to monitor a significant portion of our communications network. The beings I encountered that day weren't just observing, they were learning, studying our technology, and perhaps preparing for something larger. I still work in radio communications, but now I pay attention to more than just signal strength and frequency response. I watch for the patterns, the subtle changes that indicate we're being monitored. I've started keeping a private log of unusual readings, anomalous signals that appear and disappear too quickly for official reports. The most unsettling realization is how dependent we've become on electromagnetic communication. Every phone call, every internet search, every GPS navigation signal travels through the same spectrum that these beings seem to control so easily. If they wanted to disrupt our civilization, they wouldn't need weapons. They would just need to turn off the signals that hold our world together. But perhaps that's not their intention. Maybe they're simply curious about a species that has learned to encode its thoughts and transmit them through the air. Maybe our radio waves are as fascinating to them as their technology is to us. Either way, I know that every time I climb a transmission tower or tune a radio frequency, I'm potentially making contact with something far beyond our understanding. The night sky looks different to me now. When I see aircraft lights, I wonder if they're really aircraft. When my radio picks up strange signals, I consider the possibility that someone, or something, is trying to communicate. The electromagnetic spectrum that seemed so familiar and predictable now feels like an ocean where we've barely learned to swim, while others navigate its depths with perfect understanding. That maintenance call changed everything for me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that our technology, which we consider so advanced, might be primitive compared to what exists beyond our world. And every day I work with radio equipment, I'm reminded that we're not the only ones using these frequencies. We're sharing them with beings whose capabilities we can barely comprehend. I was working as a security guard at a research facility outside the city, one of those places that doesn't advertise what they do and where most employees need clearance just to park in the lot. My job was straightforward: monitor the cameras, check the perimeter, and make sure nobody got in who wasn't supposed to be there. It was quiet work mostly, but that night everything changed. The facility was a collection of low buildings surrounded by a high fence with razor wire. Security was tight, but not unusual for a government contractor. I'd been working there for about 6 months and had never seen anything more exciting than a false alarm from a raccoon triggering the motion sensors. The night shift was usually just me and one other guard covering different sections of the complex. It was around 2 in the morning when the first anomaly appeared on the surveillance monitors. I was making my rounds, checking each camera feed, when I noticed something odd on camera 12, which covered the east parking lot. There was a faint distortion in the image, like heat shimmer rising from hot pavement. But it was a cool night in October and the asphalt had been cold for hours. At first, I thought it might be a camera malfunction, but when I switched to the backup feed for that area, the distortion was still there. It moved slowly across the parking lot, not following any logical pattern, and it seemed to bend the light around it in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. I radioed my partner, Jake, but he was on the other side of the complex and couldn't see anything unusual from his position. I decided to investigate in person, something I probably should have cleared with the supervisor first, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out to the east lot. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of the facility's generators and the occasional car passing on the highway about a mile away. When I reached the area where I'd seen the distortion on camera, there was nothing visible to the naked eye. Just empty parking spaces under the harsh glare of the security lights. But my radio started acting up, crackling with static and occasionally picking up what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words were too distorted to make out clearly, but the rhythm and tone didn't sound human. I tried to call Jake, but got only static in response, even though we'd been communicating clearly just minutes before. My cell phone showed no signal, which was strange because I usually had decent coverage at the facility. The whole electromagnetic environment seemed to be disrupted by something I couldn't see or understand. That's when I noticed the temperature drop. It wasn't gradual like normal nighttime cooling, but sudden and localized. The air around me became noticeably colder, while areas just a few feet away remained at normal temperature. I could see my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, even though the weather was mild for the season. I aimed my flashlight at the area where the temperature was coldest, and for just a moment the beam seemed to outline something. A shape that was there, but not there, like looking at a soap bubble that's almost invisible until the light hits it just right. The outline was roughly humanoid but taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its proportions were wrong somehow, too thin and elongated. The shape moved when I pointed the light at it, not away from me, but in a deliberate pattern, like it was trying to communicate. It raised what might have been an arm and gestured toward one of the research buildings, then pointed skyward. The movement was fluid and purposeful, clearly intelligent but utterly alien in its grace. My training told me to report the incident immediately, but something held me back. Maybe curiosity or maybe some instinct that this being wasn't hostile. Whatever the reason, I found myself trying to communicate back. I raised my own arm and pointed toward the building it had indicated, then back at myself, trying to understand what it wanted. The response was immediate. The air around me shimmered, and suddenly I could see not just one figure but several of them standing in the parking lot. They were tall and thin, with smooth, featureless faces and skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with perfect coordination, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. One of them approached me slowly, its movements flowing like water. Its face turned toward mine, and although it had no visible eyes, I could feel it studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was intelligence there, vast and ancient, and completely unlike anything human. I felt like an insect being examined by a scientist. Without warning, images flooded my mind. Not words or sounds, but pure information conveyed directly into my consciousness. I saw the research facility from above, saw the experiments being conducted in the underground laboratories, saw technologies that we were developing that these beings found concerning. They weren't here to harm us, but to monitor our progress, to ensure we didn't cross certain boundaries. The facility was working on advanced propulsion systems, trying to replicate technology that had been recovered from crash sites decades earlier. The beings showed me how these experiments were being watched, how every breakthrough was cataloged and assessed for its potential impact on what they called the greater balance. I understood somehow that humanity was at a crossroads, that the technologies we were developing could either elevate us to join a galactic community or destroy us if misused. These beings were observers and occasional interveners, ensuring that species like ours didn't accidentally unleash forces they couldn't control. The communication lasted only moments, but felt like hours. When it ended, I found myself standing alone in the parking lot with no sign that the beings had ever been there. My radio crackled back to life and Jake's voice came through clearly, asking about my status. I told him everything was normal, though normal felt like a word that no longer had any meaning. I completed my shift without further incident, but couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. When I got home, I researched the facility online, finding only vague descriptions of defense research and development. Nothing about the specific projects I'd been shown in those visions, but I knew they were real. I'd seen them through alien eyes. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention to the activities at the facility. I noticed patterns I'd missed before: deliveries arriving at odd hours, personnel entering through unmarked doors, sections of the complex that were off-limits even to security staff. The place was clearly involved in projects far beyond what they publicly acknowledged. I never saw the beings again, but sometimes I felt their presence, a subtle change in the electromagnetic field, or a brief temperature drop in areas where the cameras showed distortions. I began to understand that they were always watching, maintaining their vigil over humanity's technological development. The weight of that knowledge was overwhelming. I was just a security guard with a high school education, but I'd been given a glimpse into a reality that most people couldn't imagine. I'd learned that we weren't alone, and that our progress was being monitored by intelligences far beyond our current understanding. I eventually quit that job. The burden of keeping such secrets was too much, and I couldn't continue working there knowing what I knew about the Watchers and their concerns for our future. I took a position at a regular office building where the most unusual thing I might encounter would be someone forgetting their keycard. But I never forgot that night in the parking lot or the beings who showed me glimpses of our true place in the universe. Sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still ensuring that humanity doesn't stumble into technologies that could threaten the delicate balance they work so hard to maintain. The experience changed my perspective on everything. We think we're the masters of our own destiny, but there are forces at work beyond our comprehension guiding and protecting us even when we don't realize it. Those beings weren't our enemies. They were guardians making sure we survive long enough to mature as a species. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital where I work as a lab technician. It was nearly midnight, and the roads were mostly empty, just the occasional truck or late-night traveler like myself. I was taking my usual route through the countryside, which winds through farmland and small patches of forest. It's peaceful driving and helps me decompress after long days spent analyzing blood samples and running diagnostic tests. About halfway home, I noticed something unusual in my rearview mirror. 2 bright lights following at a considerable distance. At first, I assumed it was another vehicle, maybe someone else heading home from work. But as I continued driving, the lights maintained exactly the same distance behind me, never getting closer, never falling back. I slowed down, expecting the vehicle to pass, but the lights slowed down too, maintaining that precise following distance. I sped up slightly and they matched my speed perfectly. It was like they were locked onto my position, maintaining a specific separation no matter what I did. This continued for several miles through curves and hills with the lights never varying their distance or position. Growing concerned, I decided to test whether this was intentional. I took a sudden turn onto a side road that led toward a small farming community. The lights followed without hesitation, making the same turn at exactly the same spot I'd turned. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was deliberately following me. The side road was narrow and winding with no streetlights and dense trees on both sides. I knew it well because I'd explored these back roads during weekend drives, but tonight the familiar route felt ominous. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing empty fields and the occasional farmhouse, but the lights behind me remained constant. I tried calling my wife on my cell phone to let her know I might be late, but the call wouldn't connect. The phone showed no signal, which was unusual because I typically had decent coverage even on these rural roads. The radio in my car started picking up static and interference, making it impossible to tune into any stations clearly. The lights behind me were getting brighter now, not because they were closer, but because they seemed to be intensifying their luminosity. They had an odd quality I'd never seen in vehicle headlights. They were too white, too pure, and they didn't seem to cast the usual cone of light that car headlights produce. Instead, they appeared to be 2 perfect spheres of radiance hanging in the darkness. I decided to pull over at a small roadside rest area that I knew was coming up ahead. Maybe whoever was following me would continue past and I could get a better look at their vehicle. As I slowed down and turned into the gravel parking area, the lights behind me came to a stop as well, maintaining their distance but now positioned at the edge of the tree line. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, doors locked, trying to see what kind of vehicle was producing those lights, but I couldn't make out any details beyond the illumination itself. No silhouette of a car or truck, no running lights or license plate, just those 2 brilliant spheres hanging motionless in the darkness. After about 10 minutes, I decided to continue home, hoping that stopping had somehow ended whatever game was being played. But as soon as I pulled back onto the road, the lights resumed their pursuit, maintaining the same precise distance as before. This pattern continued for another 15 miles through increasingly remote countryside. I began to feel genuinely frightened, not just because I was being followed, but because the behavior was so methodical, so precise. No human driver could maintain such exact positioning for so long without variation. It was like being tracked by some kind of automated system that had locked onto my vehicle. As I approached the turn to my street, I made a decision. Instead of going home and potentially leading whatever this was to my family, I continued straight, deciding to drive to the police station in town. The lights followed this new route without hesitation, confirming that they were indeed tracking me specifically. The police station was about 12 miles away in the center of our small town. As I drove through the quiet streets with their familiar storefronts and residential areas, the lights remained behind me. They seemed unaffected by the presence of street lamps or other light sources, maintaining their supernatural brilliance. I pulled into the police station parking lot and hurried inside to report what was happening. The duty officer listened to my story with professional courtesy, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. When I led him outside to look at the lights, they had vanished completely. The parking lot and surrounding streets were empty. The officer suggested that I might have been followed by someone who lost interest when they saw me heading to the police station. He took a report, but it was clear he considered the incident minor. Possibly someone who had mistaken my car for someone else's. We walked around the building checking all directions, but there was no sign of any unusual lights. I drove home taking a different route and checking my mirrors constantly, but saw nothing unusual. My wife was already asleep, and I didn't wake her to tell her about the experience. It seemed too strange to explain, and I wasn't sure she would believe me without having witnessed it herself. The next morning, I examined my car carefully, looking for any sign that something had been attached to it, some kind of tracking device or transmitter, but I found nothing. The vehicle appeared completely normal and drove normally when I took it to work the following day. I called the lab where I work and spoke to a colleague who has an interest in electronics and radio communications. I described the lights and the way my phone and radio had been affected. He suggested that some kind of electromagnetic interference could explain the communication problems, but had no theory about the lights themselves. Over the following weeks, I researched similar incidents online, and was surprised to find numerous reports of people being followed by unexplained lights that maintained precise distances and seemed to track vehicles rather than simply travel the same roads. Many of these accounts described the same electromagnetic effects I had experienced. I started paying more attention to my drives home, varying my route and departure time, but I never encountered the lights again. However, I began noticing other subtle anomalies, occasional static on my radio, brief interruptions in my cell phone signal, and rare instances where my car's electronic systems would flicker momentarily. The experience changed how I think about my daily routines. I had always considered my commute to be mundane and predictable, but now I realize that even the most ordinary activities can intersect with phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. Those lights were clearly under intelligent control, but whose intelligence remains a mystery. I've become more observant of my surroundings, more aware of the possibility that things are not always what they seem. The night sky looks different to me now. When I see lights moving in unusual patterns, I wonder if they might be the same phenomenon that followed me home. The patterns started small at first. Sarah, our team linguist, noticed them while reviewing the ancient documents we'd discovered. The symbols weren't just shifting on their own anymore, they were responding to us. When she focused on a particular section, the markings would pulse faintly, like they recognized her attention. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. We'd been working in shifts trying to decode what we'd found in that buried chamber. The treaty, if that's what it was, spoke of agreements made long before recorded history. Beings from elsewhere had come to Earth, made contact, and something had gone wrong. War had followed. The documents outlined terms for coexistence, conditions that humanity was supposed to maintain, but the details remained frustratingly vague. Sarah was the first to make the connection. She'd been studying the patterns for days when she realized they weren't just ancient text, they were instructions. The symbols described something called the balance, a delicate equilibrium that our species was meant to preserve, but preserve from what and how? The answer came in the form of those strange signals we'd been receiving. They weren't random transmissions. They were notifications, updates, progress reports on humanity's adherence to the ancient agreement. And according to what Sarah had decoded, we were failing. The night everything changed, I was alone in the lab. Sarah had gone home hours earlier, exhausted from her work with the symbols. I was reviewing her notes when the documents began to glow. Not the faint pulsing we'd grown accustomed to, but a steady, bright emanation that filled the room with pale light. I should have called the others, should have documented what was happening. Instead, I found myself drawn to the nearest document, my hand reaching out to touch its surface. The moment my fingers made contact, the world shifted. I wasn't in the lab anymore. I was standing in what looked like a vast observatory, walls lined with screens showing images of Earth from impossible angles, cities, forests, oceans, all displayed in perfect detail, but I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the screens, tall and ethereal, their forms seeming to shift between solid and translucent. One of them approached me. When it spoke, I heard the words, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. "You have found the archives," it said. "This was not intended." I tried to speak, to ask where I was, but no sound came. The being seemed to understand anyway. "The agreement your ancestors made has been forgotten," it continued. "Your species has grown beyond the boundaries that were set. The balance shifts. Images flashed across the screens around us. Forests disappearing, oceans rising, the climate changing in ways that seemed accelerated, unnatural, but interspersed with these scenes were others. Strange lights in the sky, unexplained phenomena, the very encounters we'd been investigating. We have tried to remind you," the being said, "subtle interventions, gentle corrections, but your kind does not listen." I found my voice then, somehow. "What do you want from us?" The being's form solidified slightly, and I could see what might have been eyes, deep, ancient, and infinitely sad. "We want nothing. We simply maintain what was agreed upon, but the time for subtle guidance has passed." The screens around us flickered, showing new images, not of Earth this time, but of other worlds, barren planets, dead oceans, civilizations that had once thrived but now lay in ruins. "This is what happens when the balance is lost," the being explained. "When a species grows too quickly, consumes too much, forgets its place in the greater pattern. We have seen it countless times." "And us?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Your species stands at a crossroads. The ancient compact can still be honored, but only if humanity chooses to remember, to change, to accept that they are not alone and never have been." The observatory began to fade around me. "The documents you found are not the only ones," the being said, its voice growing distant. "Others will be revealed, the choice will be made known, but time grows short." I was back in the lab, standing beside the table where the documents lay. They had returned to their normal appearance. No trace of the glow that had transported me to that impossible place. But something had changed. I could feel it. A weight of knowledge, of responsibility that I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Over the following days, reports began coming in from around the world. Archaeological teams discovering similar documents in remote locations, the same shifting symbols, the same ancient warnings. The pattern was spreading, revealing itself to those who were meant to find it. Sarah noticed the change in me immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said when I arrived at the lab the next morning. "Something like that," I replied. I told her about the observatory, about the being and its message. I expected skepticism, maybe concern for my mental state. Instead, she nodded grimly. "I've been having dreams," she said, "strange ones, about places I've never been, conversations in languages I don't know, but somehow I understand every word." We weren't the only ones. Other members of the team reported similar experiences. Dr. Martinez, our archaeologist, had been visited by figures in his sleep who showed him visions of the past, great cities that had risen and fallen long before human civilization began. Dr. Chen, our linguist, found herself automatically understanding symbol systems she'd never studied before. The pattern was clear. We hadn't just discovered these documents by chance. We'd been chosen to find them. Selected for reasons we didn't fully understand to serve as translators, interpreters, bridges between our world and something far older and more complex. The weight of that realization settled over our team like a shroud. We were no longer simply researchers investigating an ancient mystery. We were participants in something that would determine the future of our species. And with each passing day, as more documents surfaced around the world and more people began experiencing contact, one thing became increasingly clear. The beings watching us were not content to remain hidden much longer. The subtle approach was ending. Soon, humanity would have to confront the truth of what we'd agreed to so long ago and decide whether we were willing to honor it. The choice was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. Beyond the sky, alien and UFO encounters to sleep to, I was stationed at a remote research facility in northern Alaska, working as a communications technician during the long winter months when daylight barely touched the horizon. The isolation was part of the job, but what I experienced during those endless nights would change everything I thought I knew about our place in the universe. It started with the equipment acting strangely. Radio frequencies would drift without explanation. Satellite feeds would develop mysterious interference patterns, and our electromagnetic field detectors would spike at precisely 3:17 each morning. At first, we attributed these anomalies to solar activity or atmospheric disturbances common at such high latitudes. But the patterns were too regular, too deliberate to be natural phenomena. The facility housed a massive communications array designed to monitor deep space transmissions. We were listening for signals from distant galaxies, searching for patterns that might indicate intelligent life. What we found was much closer than anyone anticipated. On the 14th night of January, during a particularly severe blizzard that had cut us off from the outside world, our instruments detected something extraordinary. A low-frequency pulse emanated from somewhere beneath the permafrost, rhythmic and purposeful like a heartbeat. The signal's strength suggested the source was enormous, perhaps miles across, buried deep in the frozen earth. As we traced the transmission patterns, we realized they were responding to our own equipment. Every time we adjusted our receivers, the underground signal would shift accordingly, as if acknowledging our presence. Dr. Sarah Chen, our lead researcher, became obsessed with decoding the transmissions. She worked through the night, mapping frequency variations and analyzing the mathematical relationships within the signal structure. What she discovered sent chills through our small team. The patterns weren't random electromagnetic noise. They were coordinates pointing to specific locations across the Arctic where similar signals were emerging from the ice. On the 16th night, the signals changed dramatically. Instead of the steady pulse we'd grown accustomed to, we received what could only be described as a greeting. A complex series of mathematical progressions, prime number sequences, and geometric patterns that demonstrated unmistakable intelligence. But more unsettling was the realization that these signals had been waiting for us. The timing of their activation coincided perfectly with our arrival at the facility. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen realized the signals contained embedded instructions for modifying our equipment. Following these alien blueprints, we reconfigured our array into something far more sophisticated than its original design. The moment we activated the modified system, everything changed. Our screens filled with images from across the galaxy, real-time transmissions from civilizations we never knew existed. But with this knowledge came a terrible understanding. Earth was part of a vast network, a cosmic communication grid that had been monitoring our planet for millennia. The signals from beneath the ice weren't just making contact, they were reporting our technological progress to something far beyond our world. We had unknowingly triggered an ancient surveillance system, and now they knew we were ready for the next phase. The images showed other worlds, other species that had reached similar technological milestones. Some thrived under the guidance of their cosmic overseers. Others had vanished entirely, their planets left barren and silent. The choice, it seemed, was simple: accept integration into their network or face the consequences of isolation in an increasingly hostile universe. As I monitored these transmissions night after night, I began to understand the true scope of what we'd discovered. The signals weren't just communication, they were invitations to join something ancient and vast. Every technological civilization eventually reached this moment, this choice between cosmic citizenship and extinction. The underground network had been waiting patiently beneath our feet, dormant until we developed the capability to hear their call. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable. We were no longer just researchers studying the cosmos. We had become Earth's first ambassadors to an alien confederation that spanned the galaxy. The responsibility was crushing, knowing that our response would determine the fate of every human being on the planet. On the 20th night, new signals arrived. These weren't instructions or greetings, but warnings. Other factions existed within the cosmic network, entities that viewed emerging civilizations not as potential allies, but as threats to be eliminated. Time was running short. Earth's window for peaceful integration was closing, and decisions would soon be made for us if we failed to respond appropriately. The isolation of our Arctic facility suddenly felt like a blessing and a curse. We were the only humans who knew the truth, the only ones capable of making first contact with beings whose technology and intentions remained largely mysterious. The signals continued each night, growing more urgent, more insistent. They were waiting for our answer, and the silence was becoming ominous. I was working the evening shift at a small manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town when the first incident occurred. The facility operated around the clock, producing electronic components for various tech companies. My job involved monitoring automated systems and ensuring production lines ran smoothly through the night hours. It was routine work, predictable and quiet, which made what happened next all the more disturbing. Around 11:30, our security cameras began malfunctioning in a peculiar way. Instead of the typical static or blank screens you'd expect from equipment failure, the monitors showed images that didn't match our facility. Hallways that were too long, rooms filled with equipment I'd never seen before, and corridors that seemed to extend far beyond the actual dimensions of our building. I initially assumed it was a software glitch, perhaps a crossed signal from another security system nearby. But as I cycled through different camera feeds, the anomalous images persisted. More troubling was the presence of figures moving through these impossible spaces. They were tall, elongated beings wearing what appeared to be form-fitting metallic suits. Their movements were fluid, purposeful, as if they belonged in those strange environments. The timestamps on the security footage showed current times, but the locations were impossible. Our plant was a single-story structure with clearly defined boundaries, yet the cameras were somehow capturing multi-level facilities with advanced technology far beyond anything we manufactured. I tried to radio our main security office, but communications were down throughout the building. As the night progressed, the anomalous footage became more frequent and detailed. I could see the beings interacting with complex machinery, analyzing displays filled with symbols and diagrams I couldn't interpret. Most unsettling was when they appeared to notice the cameras. Several times the figures would turn and look directly into the lens, as if aware they were being observed. By 3 in the morning, the regular security feeds had disappeared entirely. Every monitor showed the otherworldly facility, and I realized I was witnessing something far more significant than a technical malfunction. This wasn't a crossed signal or equipment failure. It was a window into another reality, possibly another dimension entirely. The beings seemed to be conducting some kind of survey or inspection. They moved through spaces that defied physics, examining equipment that appeared to be monitoring our world. Charts and displays showed what looked like Earth's continents, but with additional details and overlays that suggested knowledge far beyond human understanding. One particular sequence showed a being standing before a massive display screen filled with data streams and geometric patterns. The information appeared to be updating in real time, tracking various global systems, weather patterns, electromagnetic fields, population centers, and technological networks. It was as if they were maintaining a comprehensive database of Earth's status and development. The most chilling moment came when the camera feed showed one of the beings accessing what appeared to be historical records. Images flashed across their displays showing key moments in human history: the Industrial Revolution, the development of nuclear technology, the launch of satellites, the creation of the Internet. They were documenting our technological evolution with frightening precision. Around 4:30, the feeds began showing something new. The beings were preparing equipment that seemed designed for transportation or communication across vast distances. Crystalline structures hummed with energy while complex arrays of sensors and transmitters activated in sequence. It became clear they were preparing to make contact or perhaps implement some predetermined protocol. The final transmission showed the lead being approaching what appeared to be a communication console. As their hands moved across the interface, every electronic device in our facility began responding. Machines that had been dormant for maintenance suddenly activated. Production lines started running unusual patterns, and our computer systems began downloading massive amounts of data from unknown sources. In those last moments before the feeds cut out permanently, I understood that what I had witnessed wasn't just observation, it was preparation. These beings had been monitoring our technological development, waiting for us to reach a specific threshold. Now that we had achieved whatever benchmark they were measuring, the next phase of their plan was beginning. The security cameras returned to normal by morning shift change, showing only our familiar plant interior. But the experience left me with the unshakable knowledge that we are not alone, and we are not unobserved. Somewhere beyond our perception, advanced beings are tracking our progress and preparing for what comes next. I had been driving the same route home from work for over 3 years when the encounters began. The road stretched through rural farmland for nearly 20 miles, with only scattered houses and the occasional gas station breaking the monotony of fields and forest. It was a peaceful drive, especially during the early evening hours when traffic was light and the setting sun painted the landscape in warm, golden hues. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late September. I was about halfway home, traveling through a section where the road curved gently between 2 hills, when my car's electrical system began acting erratically. The radio cycled through stations on its own. The dashboard lights flickered in patterns I'd never seen before, and the GPS display showed my location as coordinates that didn't correspond to any known geography. At first, I attributed these malfunctions to interference from the radio tower visible on the distant hilltop. But, as I continued driving, the electrical disturbances intensified rather than diminished. The engine's performance remained normal, but every electronic component seemed to be responding to some external signal or force. Then I noticed the lights following me. They appeared first as distant points of illumination in my rearview mirror, maintaining a consistent distance regardless of my speed. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I accelerated, they matched my pace perfectly. The lights weren't attached to any visible vehicle, and they moved with a smoothness that suggested they were floating rather than traveling along the road. Over the following weeks, these encounters became a regular occurrence. Each evening, as I passed through the same section of a rural highway, the electrical disturbances would begin, and the mysterious lights would appear. They never came closer than a quarter mile, but their presence was unmistakable. Sometimes there were 3 lights arranged in a triangular formation. Other times, a single bright orb would follow at a distance, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost like communication. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the lights themselves, but the effect they had on the surrounding environment. As they followed me, the radio would pick up transmissions in languages I couldn't identify. The GPS would display routes to destinations that didn't exist on any map. Most strangely, the car's clock would run slow during these encounters, sometimes losing several minutes by the time I reached home. I began documenting these experiences, noting the time, duration, and specific phenomena I observed. The pattern was remarkably consistent. The encounters always began at the same bend in the road, lasted for approximately 7 miles, and ended abruptly when I reached the outskirts of town. It was as if some invisible boundary marked the limits of their surveillance zone. One evening, I decided to stop the car during an encounter. I pulled over at a small rest area and stepped outside, hoping to get a clearer view of whatever was following me. The lights immediately halted as well, maintaining their distance. In the quiet of the rural evening, I could hear a faint humming sound, like the vibration of high-voltage power lines, but with a musical quality that seemed almost organic. As I stood there watching, one of the lights detached from the group and moved closer. It approached to within 100 yards before stopping, hovering silently above the roadway. The light wasn't harsh or blinding, but had a soft pearl-like quality that seemed to generate its own atmosphere. Within that glow, I could make out a darker shape, geometric and definitely artificial in origin. The encounter lasted only a few minutes before the light rejoined its companions, and they all disappeared beyond the hills. But in those brief moments I felt a profound sense of being examined, evaluated by an intelligence that was trying to understand something about me or my routine. The experience left me with more questions than answers, but also with the certainty that I was part of some ongoing study or observation project. These encounters continued for months, becoming as regular as my daily commute. I grew oddly comfortable with their presence, even looking forward to seeing the lights each evening. They had become part of my routine, a reminder that the universe held mysteries far beyond human understanding. Whatever they were, whoever was controlling them, seemed content to simply watch and learn, maintaining their respectful distance while documenting the patterns of ordinary human life. I was part of a small archaeological team working on an excavation site in the remote desert of southern Utah when we made a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations. The site had been selected based on satellite imagery that showed unusual geometric patterns beneath the sand, formations too regular to be natural, but too old to be modern. Our initial surveys revealed what appeared to be the remains of a pre-Columbian settlement, but the artifacts we uncovered defied conventional archaeological understanding. The structures were built using construction techniques that shouldn't have existed thousands of years ago, and many of the objects we found incorporated materials and alloys that required advanced metallurgy. But the most significant discovery came in the 3rd week of excavation, when we uncovered a sealed chamber deep beneath the primary ruins. The chamber was accessed through a series of precisely carved stone passages that descended far below the expected depth of ancient construction. The walls were covered in symbols and diagrams that resembled star charts, and mathematical equations more than typical ancient artwork. At the center of the chamber, I was working the late shift at the small-town observatory, cataloging meteor activity and atmospheric disturbances. It wasn't glamorous work, but someone had to monitor the skies during the quiet hours when most people were asleep. The facility sat on a hill outside town, surrounded by nothing but fields and darkness, which made it perfect for stargazing but unsettling when you were alone. Around 2:30 a.m., I noticed something unusual on the radar display. There was a contact moving at an impossible speed, far faster than any aircraft I knew of. At first, I thought it was a malfunction. The equipment was old, and glitches weren't uncommon. But this signal was too consistent, too deliberate to be random interference. I stepped outside to see if I could spot anything with the naked eye. The night was clear, with no clouds to obscure the view. That's when I saw it. A cluster of lights moving in perfect formation across the sky. They weren't stars or satellites. These lights pulsed in sequence, creating patterns that seemed almost like communication. The objects moved with purpose, stopping and starting in ways that defied physics. No aircraft could change direction that quickly without breaking apart. I watched for nearly 20 minutes as they performed maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible. I tried to record what I was seeing, but every time I pointed my camera toward the lights, the device malfunctioned. The screen would flicker, the battery would drain rapidly, or the image would distort beyond recognition. It was as if something was actively preventing me from documenting the encounter. The strangest part came when the lights began to respond to my movements. When I walked to the left, they shifted left. When I stepped back, they moved back. It felt like they were aware of my presence, watching me as intently as I was watching them. Then, without warning, they arranged themselves into a perfect circle and began to descend. My heart raced as they came closer, close enough that I could make out individual shapes behind the lights. They weren't mechanical, at least not in any way I recognized. The surfaces seemed to ripple and flow like liquid metal. As quickly as they had appeared, the lights shot upward and vanished into the night sky. The radar screen went blank, showing no trace of their presence. It was as if they had never been there at all. I spent the rest of my shift checking and rechecking the equipment, trying to find some explanation for what I had witnessed. Everything appeared to be functioning normally. The only evidence of the encounter was my own memory, and a strange sense that I had been evaluated, studied by something far beyond human understanding. When my replacement arrived at dawn, I didn't mention what had happened. How could I explain something that left no trace? No proof except for the lingering feeling that we are not alone in this vast universe. Some experiences transcend explanation, existing in that mysterious space between what we know and what we fear to acknowledge. The memory of those lights still visits me in quiet moments, a reminder that the night sky holds secrets we may never fully comprehend. Sometimes, when I look up at the stars, I wonder if they're still out there, watching and waiting, as curious about us as we are about them. The facility was supposed to be routine monitoring work, nothing more than maintaining equipment and logging atmospheric readings in the middle of nowhere. I'd been stationed at the outpost for 6 months, part of a rotating team that kept the instruments running and transmitted data back to headquarters. The isolation didn't bother me much. I actually preferred it to the noise and chaos of the main research stations. But that changed when the readings started showing patterns that didn't make sense. It began with the electromagnetic sensors picking up regular pulses, always at the same time each night, around 2:30 in the morning. The signals were too structured to be natural, too precise in their timing and frequency. I reported it to my supervisor, thinking maybe we had faulty equipment or interference from military exercises. But the diagnostics came back clean. Everything was functioning perfectly, which made the readings even more unsettling. The patterns intensified over the following weeks. What started as simple electromagnetic pulses evolved into complex sequences, almost like coded transmissions. I began documenting everything meticulously, cross-referencing the signals with atmospheric conditions, solar activity, anything that might explain what we were detecting. Nothing correlated. The signals appeared to operate independently of any known phenomena. Then the visual confirmation started. During one of the nightly pulse sequences, I stepped outside to check the external sensors and saw lights moving in formation across the valley below. They weren't aircraft lights. No navigation strobes or engine sounds, just smooth white orbs maintaining perfect geometric patterns as they traversed the landscape. The electromagnetic readings spiked dramatically whenever these lights appeared, confirming a direct connection between what we were measuring and what I was witnessing. I tried photographing the lights, but the images came out distorted, filled with interference patterns that matched the electromagnetic signatures we were recording. It was as if the phenomena were actively interfering with our documentation attempts, allowing us to detect their presence while preventing clear evidence of their activities. The sophistication required for such selective interference suggested technology far beyond our current capabilities. The breakthrough came when I realized the electromagnetic patterns weren't random signals but were responding to our equipment. When I adjusted the transmission frequency of our communication array, the incoming patterns shifted to match. When I modified the pulse timing of our beacon, the external signals synchronized accordingly. We weren't just observing these phenomena, we were engaged in some form of communication protocol. I spent weeks learning to interpret the signal exchanges, gradually understanding that the patterns contained information about atmospheric conditions, geological features, and electromagnetic fields across vast geographical areas. The data was more comprehensive and accurate than anything our instruments could gather, suggesting a monitoring network of incredible scope and precision. Whatever was generating these signals possessed detailed knowledge of our planet's systems. The most disturbing realization was that the signals contained historical data going back decades, referencing atmospheric conditions and geological events from long before our monitoring station existed. Cross-checking with archived weather data confirmed the accuracy of these historical references, indicating continuous observations spanning generations. We weren't dealing with a recent arrival, but with an established presence that had been studying our world for an extended period. The communication attempts became more sophisticated as the weeks progressed. The signals began incorporating mathematical concepts, physical constants, and what appeared to be stellar coordinates. I recognized patterns that corresponded to local star positions, suggesting the communications originated from beings with detailed knowledge of our astronomical environment. The complexity and accuracy of this information ruled out any terrestrial explanation. One night, the signals included what I can only describe as technical schematics. The electromagnetic patterns formed three-dimensional blueprints when properly decoded, showing advanced propulsion systems and energy generation methods. The designs were functional, demonstrating principles that our current physics could barely comprehend. These weren't abstract concepts, but practical engineering solutions to problems we were still struggling to understand. The final transmission sequence was the most significant. The pattern shifted to show detailed maps of our solar system, highlighting specific locations on various planets and moons. Earth was marked with thousands of points, each corresponding to areas of geological or atmospheric significance. The precision was extraordinary, identifying underground water sources, mineral deposits, and weather pattern origins with accuracy that surpassed our best survey technologies. Then the signals stopped. After months of increasingly complex communication, the electromagnetic readings returned to normal background levels. The lights disappeared from the valley, and the sophisticated data streams ceased entirely. It was as if the monitoring phase had concluded, leaving only questions about what had been learned and what might come next. I compiled comprehensive reports documenting every signal, every visual sighting, and every technical detail I could extract from the communications. The data represented proof of advanced non-human intelligence actively studying our planet with capabilities that exceeded our understanding. But when I submitted these findings, they were classified immediately, and I was reassigned to a different project away from any monitoring equipment. The official explanation was equipment malfunction, atmospheric disturbance, and observer error. All records of the electromagnetic anomalies were sealed, and the monitoring station was decommissioned shortly after my departure. But I kept copies of the signal patterns, the decoded schematics, and the astronomical coordinates. The evidence remains, hidden but intact, documenting months of direct communication with intelligences that possess intimate knowledge of our world. Years later, I still monitor electromagnetic frequencies in my spare time, hoping to detect similar patterns. Occasionally, I pick up brief signals that match the characteristics of those earlier communications, suggesting the monitoring continues from different locations. The network remains active, gathering data and observing our development with the same methodical precision I witnessed at that remote outpost. The implications are staggering. If the communications were genuine, and the evidence strongly suggests they were, then our planet is under continuous surveillance by beings with technology centuries ahead of our own. They possess detailed knowledge of our environment, our capabilities, and our limitations. The question isn't whether we're being watched, but what conclusions they've reached about humanity and what actions those conclusions might inspire. The electromagnetic patterns I documented represented just one small window into a vast monitoring operation that spans decades and possibly centuries. Every atmospheric disturbance, every geological event, every technological development is being cataloged and analyzed by intelligences that view our world as a subject of intense scientific interest. We're living under observation by entities whose capabilities and intentions remain completely unknown. The isolation of that monitoring station provided the perfect laboratory for establishing communication with these watchers. Away from urban electromagnetic interference and military radar networks, the signals could be exchanged clearly and documented thoroughly, but that same isolation meant the discoveries could be suppressed easily, buried under classifications and reassignments that ensure the truth remains hidden from public knowledge. Sometimes I wonder if my assignment to that station was deliberate. If someone in authority knew about the electromagnetic anomalies and needed a qualified observer to document them. The timing was too convenient, the equipment too sophisticated for routine atmospheric monitoring. Perhaps the communications were expected, part of an ongoing exchange between human authorities and non-human intelligences that requires periodic technical updates and status reports. The technical schematics transmitted during those final communications haunt me most. The propulsion systems and energy generation methods demonstrated principles that could revolutionize human technology, solving our energy crises and opening the solar system to exploration. But that same technology, in the wrong hands or misunderstood applications, could destabilize our entire civilization. Maybe the gradual revelation of this knowledge requires careful preparation, ensuring humanity is ready for such transformative capabilities. The star charts and planetary surveys suggest these beings have intimate knowledge of our entire solar system, possibly extending to nearby star systems as well. The scope of their operations dwarfs anything humanity has attempted, indicating a civilization with resources and capabilities that span interstellar distances. We're dealing with entities that view our solar system as a small part of a much larger sphere of influence and activity. I was driving the late shift at a small courier service, something I'd been doing for about 6 months to make ends meet. Most nights were routine, picking up packages from businesses that stayed open late, dropping off medical supplies to clinics, that sort of thing. The routes were predictable, the roads mostly empty, and the pay was decent enough for what it was. This particular night started like any other. I had a delivery scheduled for a research facility about 40 miles outside the city, one of those places tucked away in the hills where the streetlights disappear, and the darkness feels heavier. I'd been there a few times before. Always late deliveries, always to the same loading dock where a security guard would sign for whatever I was carrying and send me on my way. The package I was transporting was about the size of a briefcase, sealed in one of those metal containers with multiple locks. The shipping label was mostly standard except for a series of numbers and letters that didn't match any coding system I recognized. I didn't think much of it at the time. Half the stuff I delivered had strange markings or classifications I didn't understand. The drive out was normal at first. Highway traffic thinned out as I got further from the city, and by the time I turned onto the winding road that led to the facility, I was alone on the asphalt. The hills rose on either side, covered in dense trees that blocked out most of the starlight. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the yellow lines and reflectors that guided the way. About 10 miles from the facility, something changed. It started with the radio. Static began bleeding through whatever station I was listening to, growing louder until it drowned out the music entirely. I tried switching channels, but every frequency was the same wall of white noise. Then the GPS screen flickered and went dark. I pulled over to check my phone, thinking maybe there was some kind of interference in the area. No signal. The screen showed I was in a dead zone, which was strange because I'd made this drive before, and always had at least one bar. I decided to keep going. I knew the route well enough, and the facility was only a few more miles up the road. That's when I noticed the lights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another car, but as I watched, the lights didn't behave like headlights. They were too bright, too steady, and they seemed to hover just above the road rather than following its contours. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they matched my pace exactly. I tried to get a better look by adjusting my mirrors, but the lights were always just at the edge of my vision. They didn't illuminate the road the way normal headlights would, and there was no sound of an engine or tires on asphalt, just those bright, unwavering points of light maintaining a perfect distance behind me. The temperature inside the van started dropping. I cranked up the heat, but it didn't seem to help. My breath began fogging, and I could feel the cold seeping through the windows like the night air had turned arctic. The metal container in the back started making soft clicking sounds, almost like it was contracting in the cold. Then my engine sputtered. The van lurched forward. The dashboard lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I was going to stall out completely in the middle of nowhere. The engine caught again, but it ran rough, like it was struggling against something. The speedometer needle jumped erratically, and the fuel gauge swung from full to empty and back again. I was starting to panic. The lights behind me were closer now, close enough that I could see they weren't attached to any vehicle. They just floated there. 3 perfect circles of white light arranged in a triangle formation. The static from the radio had changed too. It wasn't just noise anymore. There were patterns in it, rhythms that almost sounded like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The facility finally came into view, its security lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I'd never been so relieved to see a destination in my life. I pulled up to the loading dock, the lights behind me vanishing the moment I entered the perimeter of the facility's illumination. The engine smoothed out. The radio went quiet, and the temperature began returning to normal. The security guard who met me was the same one I'd dealt with before, but something about him seemed different. His movements were too precise, too measured, and when he spoke, his voice had a flat, mechanical quality that I hadn't noticed on previous visits. "Package for Dr. Morrison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and produced a handheld scanner, running it over the metal container's barcode. The device beeped once, then displayed a series of symbols that definitely weren't letters or numbers from any alphabet I knew. He seemed satisfied with whatever it said. "Any difficulties during transport?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Some radio interference," I replied. "GPS went out for a while, too." He made a note on his clipboard, the pen moving across the paper in quick, angular strokes. "That's normal for this area. Lot of electromagnetic activity in these hills." I wanted to ask about the lights that had followed me, but something in his demeanor suggested that wouldn't be welcome. Instead, I just nodded and waited for him to sign the delivery confirmation. As I was getting ready to leave, he handed me an envelope. "Your next pickup," he said. "Same route back, but there's a stop along the way." I looked at the address on the envelope. It was for a location I'd never heard of, somewhere on the same winding road I'd just traveled. The pickup time was listed as 3:17 a.m., oddly specific for what should have been a routine stop. The drive back started normally. My radio worked fine. The GPS came back online and the engine ran smooth. But as I approached the coordinates from the envelope, I began to feel that familiar sense of unease. The location turned out to be nothing more than a wide spot in the road, marked by a single reflector post. I pulled over and checked the time. 3:16 a.m. A minute later, exactly on schedule, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights. It carried a package identical to the one I'd just delivered. Same size, same metal container, same complex locking mechanism. The figure approached the van without speaking. I rolled down the window, and it handed me the package along with a shipping label. The destination was back in the city, at an address I recognized as a government building. The weight of the container felt wrong somehow, too light for its size, as if it contained something less dense than air. "Delivery instructions?" I asked, but the figure had already stepped back into the shadows. When I looked again, it was gone. The rest of the drive back to the city passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The lights that had followed me, the electromagnetic interference, the strange behavior of my vehicle, none of it made sense. And the figure in the woods had moved in the same precise, mechanical way as the security guard at the facility. I made the final delivery without any problems. The building was mostly dark, except for a few windows on the upper floors. A maintenance worker met me at the service entrance, signed for the package, and disappeared back into the building without a word. When I returned to the dispatch office, my supervisor was waiting for me. He handed me an envelope containing my pay for the night, significantly more than I usually earned for a single run. "Good work," he said. "We might have more runs like this for you if you're interested." I wanted to ask him what exactly I'd been transporting, what kind of research was being conducted at that facility, and why the whole operation felt so secretive. But the extra money was hard to ignore, and I had bills to pay. Over the next few weeks, I made several more runs to the facility. Each time, the pattern was the same. Electromagnetic interference on the way there, strange lights following me, a pickup from the mysterious figure in the woods, and a final delivery to the government building. The packages were always identical, and I was always paid well above the standard rate. I started to notice other things too. My van's odometer would sometimes show different readings than I expected, as if I'd traveled further than the actual distance between locations. My watch would run slow on nights when I made these deliveries, sometimes losing several minutes by the time I returned to the city, and I began having dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams about vast underground chambers filled with humming machinery and figures in dark clothing moving through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The last delivery I made was different from the others. When I arrived at the facility, there were additional vehicles in the parking area. Black SUVs with tinted windows and license plates I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. The security guard who met me was someone new, younger and more nervous than his predecessor. "Package for Dr. Morrison," I said, following the usual routine. He scanned the barcode, but this time the device's display showed only static. He tried several more times with the same result, growing more agitated with each attempt. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the building. I stood by the loading dock for nearly 20 minutes before he returned with two other people, a woman in a lab coat and a man in a dark suit who looked like he belonged in one of the government buildings I'd been delivering to. They examined the package carefully, running various instruments over its surface. The readings seemed to concern them. They spoke in hushed tones, using technical terms I didn't understand, but their body language suggested something was wrong. Finally, the man in the suit approached me. "Has this package been out of your possession at any point during transport?" "No," I replied. "I picked it up from dispatch and drove straight here. Any unusual occurrences during the drive?" "Equipment malfunctions, interference, anything out of the ordinary." I thought about the lights, the radio static, the cold air that had filled the van. "Some radio interference," I said carefully. "That's been happening on all these runs." He made a note in a small notebook, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to inspect your vehicle." They spent the next hour going over my van with various devices, paying particular attention to the cargo area where I'd been carrying the packages. Whatever they were looking for, they seemed to find it. The instruments beeped and clicked, displaying readings that made them exchange concerned glances. When they finished, the man in the suit handed me a check for triple my usual fee. "This will be your final run to this facility," he said. "We appreciate your discretion in this matter." I wanted to ask what was going on, what I'd been carrying, why they were shutting down the route. But something in his tone suggested that questions wouldn't be welcome. I took the check and left. A week later, I heard on the news that there had been an incident at a research facility in the hills outside the city. The report was vague. Something about a chemical leak that had been quickly contained. The facility was temporarily closed for cleanup and inspection. I drove out there a few days after the news broke, curious to see what had happened. The entire area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and security guards were posted at every access point. From the road, I could see that several of the buildings had been damaged. Scorch marks were visible on the walls, and there were what looked like impact craters in the parking lot. I never found out what I'd been transporting during those weeks, or what kind of research was being conducted at the facility. The courier service reassigned me to local routes within the city, and I never had another run that involved strange packages or mysterious pickups in the woods, but sometimes when I'm driving late at night on empty roads, I catch glimpses of lights in my rearview mirror that don't behave quite like normal headlights. And sometimes, when the radio picks up static between stations, I hear patterns in the noise that remind me of those voices speaking in an unknown language. I kept the extra money I earned from those runs, but I've never felt entirely comfortable spending it. It sits in a separate account, untouched, like evidence of something I'm not sure I want to remember, because whatever I was part of during those weeks, whatever role I played in transporting those packages between the facility and the government building, I have the feeling it was just one small piece of something much larger and more complex than I could ever understand. Beyond the Sky, Alien and UFO Encounters to Sleep To, Part 7. The evening shift at the observatory was supposed to be routine. I'd been monitoring deep space signals for nearly 3 years, and most nights brought nothing more than cosmic background radiation and the occasional satellite interference. The equipment hummed quietly in the darkened control room, banks of monitors displaying wavelengths and frequencies that painted pictures of the universe most people would never see. It was just past 11 when the first anomaly appeared. A sharp, rhythmic pulse cutting through the static on frequency 1420.4 megahertz, the hydrogen line, where most SETI researchers focus their attention. But this wasn't random noise. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate. 3 short pulses, followed by 2 long ones, then a pause. Over and over again. I leaned forward, adjusting the filters and amplifying the signal. The pattern remained consistent, unwavering. My hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, isolating the transmission and running it through our analysis software. The computer confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't coming from any known terrestrial source. The signal originated from a point roughly 12 degrees above the horizon, in the direction of the constellation Lyra. I swiveled the main dish toward the coordinates, fine-tuning the alignment until the signal strength peaked. Whatever was out there, it was broadcasting with considerable power. I reached for the phone to call Dr. Hendricks, the project director, but something made me hesitate. The signal was changing. The simple pattern of pulses had evolved into something more complex, a mathematical sequence that made my breath catch in my throat. Prime numbers: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. Then it paused and began again with the Fibonacci sequence. This wasn't random cosmic noise. This was intelligence. My heart pounded as I started the recording equipment, capturing every pulse and pause. The transmission continued for exactly 17 minutes, cycling through mathematical concepts that any advanced civilization would understand. Then, without warning, it stopped. I sat in the sudden silence, staring at the monitors. The frequency had gone dead, showing only the familiar background hiss of deep space. I rewound the recording and played it back, confirming that I hadn't imagined it. The patterns were clear, unmistakable. That's when I noticed something else. During the transmission, several other monitoring stations around the world had detected unusual readings, atmospheric disturbances, electromagnetic fluctuations, and gravitational anomalies all occurring at the exact same time as my signal. Whatever had sent that message, it was affecting our entire planet in ways we barely understood. I finally called Dr. Hendricks, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd recorded. He arrived within an hour, bringing 2 other researchers with him. We spent the rest of the night analyzing the data, running it through every filter and algorithm we had. The conclusion was inescapable. We had documented the first confirmed transmission from an extraterrestrial intelligence, but the story didn't end there. 3 days later, the signal returned. Same frequency, same mathematical precision, but this time the message was different. Instead of basic mathematical concepts, it contained what appeared to be star charts, precise coordinates in 3-dimensional space that mapped to real stellar objects in our galaxy. The transmission lasted exactly 17 minutes again, then vanished. This pattern continued for weeks. Every 72 hours, at precisely the same time, the signal would return with new information: star maps, chemical formulas, even what looked like technical diagrams for technologies we couldn't begin to understand. We established a response protocol, transmitting our own mathematical sequences back toward the source. The results were immediate and startling. The next transmission included variations of our own mathematical concepts, proving that whoever was sending these messages was not only receiving our responses, but actively engaging with them. The implications were staggering. We were involved in the first genuine dialogue between human civilization and an extraterrestrial intelligence. The government classified the project immediately, and our small team was sworn to secrecy while larger resources were brought to bear on the situation. As weeks turned to months, the conversations became more sophisticated. The aliens, for lack of a better term, began transmitting information about their technology, their civilization, even their history. They came from a star system 47 light-years away, had been monitoring Earth for centuries, and had finally decided the time was right for contact. But they weren't ready for physical meeting. The transmissions made it clear that they were concerned about the impact such contact might have on human society. Instead, they proposed a gradual introduction, sharing knowledge and ideas through these radio conversations while humanity slowly adapted to the reality of not being alone in the universe. The most remarkable revelation came 6 months into the exchange. The aliens explained that Earth wasn't their first contact with a developing civilization. They were part of a vast network of intelligent species spread across the galaxy, all connected through similar communication protocols. Humanity was being invited to join this galactic community, but only when we demonstrated the wisdom and maturity to handle such responsibility. The transmissions continued for over a year, each one bringing new insights into technologies that could revolutionize human civilization. Clean energy systems, faster-than-light communication methods, even medical techniques that could eliminate most diseases. But the aliens were careful to share only what they believed humanity was ready to receive. I remained part of the project throughout this period, one of the few people on Earth who knew that everything had changed. We were no longer alone, and our cosmic neighbors were watching, waiting to see if we would prove worthy of joining their community. The last transmission I personally received came on a cold December night. Instead of technical data or star charts, it contained something unexpected: music. Complex harmonies that seemed to capture the essence of an alien culture, beautiful and haunting in ways that human music had never achieved. It was their way of saying goodbye, at least for now. The project was transferred to a larger facility, and my role officially ended. But I knew the conversations were continuing, somewhere in a classified location far from public view. Humanity's first steps into a larger universe were being taken in secret, guided by beings who had already walked that path. Sometimes late at night I still tuned the radio to that special frequency, hoping to catch another transmission. The hydrogen line remains mostly quiet now, filled with nothing but cosmic background radiation. But I know they're still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to the world. The knowledge weighs on me sometimes, knowing that we're not alone, that there's an entire galactic civilization waiting for us to join them, while the rest of humanity remains unaware. But I understand their caution. First contact isn't just about exchanging messages. It's about fundamentally changing how our species sees itself and its place in the universe. When that day finally comes, when the truth is revealed to everyone, I hope humanity will be ready. Because beyond our small blue planet, in the vast darkness between the stars, there are friends waiting to welcome us home. The forest ranger station sat at the edge of wilderness so remote that cell towers couldn't reach it. I'd been working these mountains for 8 years, comfortable with the isolation and the rhythm of seasons that most people never experienced. My job was simple: monitor the trails, check on campers, and report anything unusual to headquarters via the old radio system that connected our scattered outposts. It was during the third week of October when the reports started coming in. Hikers mentioned strange lights moving through the trees at night, always just out of clear sight. Campers complained about electronic equipment failing without explanation, GPS units freezing, cameras malfunctioning, cell phones dying despite full batteries. Most wrote it off as the usual quirks of being deep in the wilderness, but the frequency of these incidents was increasing. I began paying closer attention during my evening patrols, taking routes that would let me investigate the areas where sightings had been reported. For several nights, I found nothing unusual. The forest felt normal, quiet but alive with the subtle sounds of nocturnal animals and rustling leaves. Then I saw them. I was checking on a remote campsite when points of light appeared in my peripheral vision. Not the steady glow of flashlights or the flicker of campfires, but something else entirely. Spheres of soft, blue-white radiance drifting silently between the trees about 50 yards away. They moved with purpose but followed no pattern I could understand, sometimes rising 20 feet into the air, sometimes skimming just above the forest floor. I approached carefully, trying to get close enough for a better look, but the spheres seemed aware of my presence, maintaining their distance while continuing their mysterious dance through the trees. They cast no shadows and made no sound, existing in complete defiance of everything I thought I knew about the natural world. When I tried to photograph them with my emergency camera, the device simply wouldn't function. The lens wouldn't focus, and the flash fired randomly without my input. I attempted to call it in on my radio, but got only static. Whatever these things were, they created some kind of interference field that disrupted electronics. The spheres continued their patrol for nearly an hour before gradually fading away, not disappearing suddenly, but dimming like dying embers until they were gone. I marked the location and returned the next morning to search for any physical evidence. The area showed no signs of disturbance, no burned vegetation, no unusual residue, no tracks of any kind. Over the following weeks, the sightings became more frequent and more complex. The spheres appeared in groups of 3 to 7, sometimes forming geometric patterns as they moved through the forest. They seemed particularly active around areas where the terrain was unusual, near underground streams, old mine shafts, or places where the rock formations created natural caves. I began keeping a detailed log, noting the time, location, and behavior of each sighting. Patterns emerged. The spheres appeared most often between midnight and 3 in the morning. They favored areas with little human activity but seemed drawn to investigate when campers were present. They never approached closer than about 30 yards to any person, maintaining what felt like a deliberate safety distance. The most unsettling encounter happened on a foggy November night. I was investigating reports of strange sounds near Miller's Creek when I found myself surrounded by more than a dozen spheres. They formed a loose circle around me, hovering silently in the mist. I stood perfectly still, unsure whether to retreat or remain calm. One sphere drifted closer than any had before, stopping just beyond arm's reach. As I watched, its surface seemed to shift and ripple, revealing complex patterns of light that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. I had the distinct impression that it was scanning me, gathering information about my biology and intentions. The examination lasted several minutes before the sphere rejoined the others. The entire group then moved away in perfect formation, disappearing into the fog with the same silent grace they had shown throughout all my encounters with them. I tried to report these incidents through official channels, but my descriptions were met with skepticism. The phenomena didn't fit into any category that Park Service protocols could address. I was advised to document everything carefully, but avoid discussing it with visitors or local media. The spheres continued their activities throughout the winter, though sightings became less frequent as snow made the deeper forest areas inaccessible. When spring arrived, their behavior changed noticeably. Instead of random patrols, they began concentrating their activities around a particular valley that had always felt different from the surrounding wilderness. I made several attempts to explore this valley more thoroughly, but each time I approached, my equipment would malfunction, and I'd experience a disorientation that made navigation impossible. It was as if the area was protected by some invisible barrier that discouraged investigation without being overtly hostile. The spheres weren't the only unusual activity in the forest. Wildlife behavior became increasingly erratic. Birds would suddenly fall silent and remain motionless for extended periods. Deer and elk avoided certain areas entirely, creating migration patterns that made no biological sense. Even the insects seemed affected, with normal pollination cycles disrupted in ways that threatened the health of local plant communities. I documented everything, filling notebook after notebook with observations and sketches. The data painted a picture of an ecosystem under the influence of something unprecedented. The spheres weren't just mysterious lights. They were part of a larger phenomenon that was subtly altering the environment in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. My final encounter with the spheres occurred just before my transfer to a different station. I was conducting a routine trail inspection when I found a clearing I'd never seen before, despite having worked this area for years. In the center of the clearing stood a perfectly circular area, where the vegetation had been replaced by an intricate pattern of stones and crystalline formations. The spheres were there, dozens of them, hovering in a complex three-dimensional array above the pattern. As I watched from the tree line, they began to pulse in unison, creating waves of light that seemed to activate the crystal formations below. The entire display lasted only a few minutes before the spheres dispersed and the clearing fell silent. When I returned the next day with additional equipment, the clearing was gone. In its place was normal forest, showing no sign that anything unusual had ever occurred there. Even my GPS readings didn't match the coordinates I had recorded, as if the space itself had somehow shifted. I completed my transfer without mentioning this final encounter to anyone. The official reports I filed described the sphere sightings in carefully neutral language, focusing on the need for further investigation rather than drawing any conclusions about their origin or purpose. I still work for the Park Service, but in a different capacity now. Sometimes I receive reports from other rangers describing phenomena similar to what I experienced. I advise them to document everything carefully and remain open to possibilities that challenge conventional understanding. The spheres taught me that our wilderness areas harbor mysteries far beyond what we've cataloged or explained. Whether they represent some unknown natural phenomenon or something else entirely, they've been conducting their activities in the remote forests for who knows how long. We're only now beginning to notice because our presence in these areas has increased enough to occasionally witness their work. I keep my notebooks from those months filled with observations that read like science fiction, but document experiences that were undeniably real. Somewhere in the deep forests, the spheres continue their mission, whatever that might be. They remain patient, persistent, and ultimately unknowable. A reminder that there are still frontiers on our own planet that we've barely begun to explore. The memories of that night in the Pacific still haunt me, but what happened 6 months later changed everything I thought I knew about those lights. I was stationed at a different base, a remote outpost in the Nevada desert where we tested experimental aircraft. The kind of place that doesn't exist on maps, and where asking too many questions gets you reassigned. It was during a routine night exercise when I first noticed the interference. Our communications went dead, radar screens flickered, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. That's when I saw them again. 3 lights, arranged in the same perfect triangle I'd witnessed over the ocean, hovering silently above the runway. This time was different, though. Instead of observing from a distance, the formation descended slowly, deliberately, until it was less than 100 feet above the tarmac. The lights weren't harsh or blinding. They pulsed with a soft, almost organic rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The air itself felt charged, like standing in the eye of an electrical storm. My commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, stood frozen beside me. A man who'd flown combat missions in 3 different wars, reduced to complete stillness by something he couldn't understand or fight. The base's security lights flickered and died one by one, plunging us into darkness except for those 3 points of light hanging in the void above us. That's when the communication began. Not through radios or any technology we recognized, but directly into our minds. It wasn't words exactly, more like concepts and emotions flowing through our consciousness. Images of distant worlds, civilizations that had risen and fallen across millennia, and always that same sense of patient observation. They showed us Earth as they saw it, a small blue marble in an endless ocean of stars, teeming with life that was just beginning to understand its place in the universe. We were children, taking our first steps into a much larger reality, and they had been watching, waiting, documenting our progress for longer than human civilization had existed. The most unsettling part wasn't the presence of these beings, but the realization of how insignificant our military might was in comparison. Our most advanced aircraft, our weapons, our entire understanding of physics seemed primitive against technology that could travel between stars and manipulate consciousness itself. Colonel Hayes later described feeling a profound sense of responsibility during those moments. Not fear, but an overwhelming awareness that humanity was being evaluated. Our response to this contact, our willingness to move beyond aggression and embrace a larger perspective, would determine how this relationship would evolve. The lights began to pulse faster, their rhythm shifting from the slow, hypnotic beat to something more urgent. Through that strange mental connection, we understood they were preparing to leave, but before they did, they left us with something. Not physical evidence that could be studied or weapons that could be reverse engineered, but knowledge, an understanding that we were not alone, that we never had been, and that our future depended on how we chose to grow from this moment. As quickly as they had appeared, the lights ascended into the night sky, their triangular formation maintained until they became indistinguishable from the stars. The base's power systems came back online, communications crackled to life, and the desert returned to its normal temperature. But nothing would ever be normal again. The official report classified the incident as a weather anomaly combined with the equipment malfunction. Hayes and I were transferred to different assignments within the week, our security clearances adjusted to ensure our silence. But some experiences transcend classification levels and non-disclosure agreements. Some truths are too important to bury completely. In the years since that night, I've heard similar accounts from other military personnel, pilots who've encountered craft that defy known physics, radar operators who've tracked objects moving at impossible speeds, ground crews who've witnessed technology that makes our most advanced systems look like stone tools. All sworn to secrecy, all carrying the weight of knowledge that changes everything. What strikes me most about these encounters is their consistency. The beings we've encountered don't seem interested in conquest or destruction. They observe, they document, they occasionally make contact when circumstances align. It's as if they're conducting a long-term study, watching our species navigate the challenges of technological advancement and social evolution. The triangle of lights that night in Nevada wasn't just a UFO sighting. It was a glimpse into humanity's future, a preview of the cosmic community we might one day join if we can overcome our tendency toward conflict and embrace our role as stewards of this small blue world. Hayes retired from the military 2 years later and became a teacher. He told me once that after seeing what we saw, dedicating his life to education felt like the most important thing he could do. Preparing the next generation for a reality far stranger and more wonderful than anything we'd been taught to expect, the lights continued to appear, witnessed by pilots and sailors, farmers and security guards, people from every walk of life who find themselves in the right place at the right time to glimpse something extraordinary. Each encounter adds another piece to a puzzle that's been assembling itself for decades, maybe centuries. We're not alone. We never have been. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, patient observers continue their vigil, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to take its place in a universe far more complex and connected than we ever imagined. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether we're prepared for what comes next when they decide we're ready for more than just fleeting glimpses of light in the night sky. Until then, they watch, they wait, and they document our slow journey toward understanding our true place in the cosmos. I've been working on my backyard astronomy for years, always setting up my telescope in the same spot behind the house where the light pollution stays manageable. Most nights follow the same routine. Unfold the chair, adjust the scope, and settle in with my star charts and a thermos of something warm. The sky out there reveals itself in layers if you're patient enough to wait and watch. This particular evening started no different from countless others. October air carried that crisp edge that makes stargazing comfortable, and the forecast promised clear skies through midnight. I'd been tracking a few interesting objects in Cassiopeia, sketching their positions and noting any changes from night to night. The constellation sits high this time of year, making it perfect for extended observation. Around 10:30, I was adjusting the focus on a double star when something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. A faint light, steady but distinctly separate from the star field I'd been studying. It wasn't the usual aircraft strobe or satellite track. This light pulsed with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost like it was trying to communicate something. I pulled back from the eyepiece and scanned the area with just my eyes. The light appeared to be positioned just outside the main pattern of Cassiopeia, hovering in a spot where no bright star should exist. When I checked my charts, nothing matched that location. I've been doing this long enough to know the major stars by heart, and this was definitely something new. Through the telescope, the object revealed itself more clearly. It wasn't a point source like a star, but rather a soft, diffused glow that seemed to shift slightly as I watched. The pulsing continued, growing brighter and dimmer in cycles that lasted about 3 seconds each. No airplane behaves like that, and satellites don't hover in fixed positions. I spent the next 20 minutes observing and taking notes. The object maintained its position relative to the surrounding stars, ruling out anything in our atmosphere. But it also showed none of the characteristics of known celestial objects. Stars don't pulse with such regularity, and planets don't emit their own light in patterns. The strangest part came when I tried to photograph it. My camera, which usually captures star fields beautifully, seemed unable to register the object. I took several shots with different exposure settings, but when I reviewed them later, that section of sky appeared completely normal. Only my eyes could see what was actually there. After about an hour of observation, the pulsing began to change. Instead of the steady 3-second rhythm, it started varying the intervals. Sometimes quick flashes, sometimes longer glows, as if testing different patterns. I found myself unconsciously trying to decode what felt like a sequence, though I couldn't identify any clear message. Then, Without warning, the light began to move. Not the smooth arc of a satellite or the predictable path of an aircraft, but a series of precise geometric movements. It traced what looked like a triangle in the sky, returned to its original position, then repeated the pattern twice more. Each movement was deliberate and controlled, covering distances that would require incredible speed for any known technology. The whole display lasted maybe 5 minutes before the object simply faded away. Not a dramatic exit, just a gradual dimming until it merged with the background darkness. I kept watching that spot for another hour, but nothing returned. The stars resumed their ancient patterns as if nothing had disturbed their eternal dance. I've returned to that same observation spot many times since, always checking that region of Cassiopeia. Sometimes I think I catch a faint glimmer in the same area, but nothing as clear or sustained as that first encounter. My telescope shows only the expected stars and deep sky objects that belong there. The experience changed how I approach my stargazing sessions. I still enjoy tracking familiar objects and noting their movements, but now I also spend time just watching, staying alert for anything that doesn't fit the expected patterns. The universe clearly holds more mysteries than our charts and catalogs suggest. Most astronomers would probably dismiss what I saw as atmospheric phenomena or equipment malfunction, but I know what I observed that night, and I know it wasn't natural. Something intelligent was out there, demonstrating capabilities far beyond our current understanding. Whether it was testing our awareness, attempting communication, or simply conducting its own observations, I may never know. What stays with me most is the sense of being watched in return. As I studied that pulsing light through my telescope, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was studying me as well. The geometric patterns it traced felt like a response to my attention, as if acknowledging that contact had been made. The night sky seems different now, full of possibilities I'd never considered before. Every faint star could be something more. Every unusual glimmer might signal another presence among the cosmic vastness. I continue my regular observations, but with the understanding that we may not be alone in our curiosity about what lies beyond our small corner of existence. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between observations, I find myself wondering if that encounter was unique, or if others have witnessed similar displays. Perhaps amateur astronomers around the world have their own stories of lights that don't belong, patterns that suggest intelligence, brief glimpses of something extraordinary hiding in plain sight among the stars. For now, I keep watching and waiting, knowing that the universe still holds secrets worth discovering. That pulsing light reminded me that even in our age of advanced technology and space exploration, we've barely begun to understand what's really out there, watching us as intently as we watch the night sky. I was part of a 3-plane patrol that night, flying over the northern plains under a sky full of stars. It was the kind of night pilots love: clear air, no turbulence, and the horizon stretched out endlessly. The mission was straightforward, just routine surveillance. Nothing ever happened on these runs, and I wasn't expecting this one to be any different. We were cruising at 30,000 feet, spread out in a loose V formation. It was quiet, except for the hum of the engines and the occasional chatter over the radio. I remember glancing at my instruments, everything reading normal. That's when it started. At first, I thought it was interference, just a low hum bleeding into my headset. It was faint, almost like the static you'd get if the comms weren't tuned right. But then it shifted. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm, like a melody, but not one I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human. "Tower, this is Echo 1, I said, checking in. "I'm picking up a strange signal. Is there a weather anomaly in the area?" The response was garbled, just static. The signal had drowned them out. Echo 1, come again. Ramirez, flying to my left, called over the squad comm. You're cutting out. Same here, Morales added from the right. Signals breaking up. Before I could reply, the sound changed. It was clearer now, no longer just a hum. It had depth, layers, instruments that didn't exist, voices that weren't voices, weaving together into something too perfect to be natural. It filled my headset, pushing everything else aside. I could still hear the others talking, but it was distant, like they were behind a wall. The music wasn't just sound, it was something else. It pulled at me, tugging at memories, feelings, things I couldn't even name. I had this overwhelming urge to follow it. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Ramirez was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Yeah, I hear it." Morales cut in, his voice tighter. "What is that? Is it music?" None of us could explain it, but we all felt it. The melody seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the air itself was singing. It wasn't just in our headsets. It was in the space around us, vibrating in our bones. And then I saw it. A glimmer, just ahead and below us, like moonlight on water. It was faint, but it moved, shimmering in the darkness. "There's something out there," I said, leaning forward against my restraints. 9 o'clock low. Do you see it? "Got it," Ramirez replied. "What the hell is that?" We turned toward it, breaking formation slightly. As we got closer, the glimmer grew brighter, more defined. It wasn't a reflection. It was a craft, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had no sharp edges, no seams. It was smooth, almost organic, with a faint silvery glow that seemed to pulse in time with the music. "I don't like this," Morales said. "We should report back." "Radio's useless," Ramirez pointed out. "We can't call it in." "Stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own nerves in check. "Let's get closer, but stay spread out." As we approached, the craft shifted, turning toward us. It didn't have lights like a plane, but its surface rippled, reflecting the stars in a way that made it hard to tell where it ended and the sky began. The music grew louder, more complex, wrapping around us like a physical presence. And then it happened. My jet slowed, not because I pulled back, but because something else was doing it. The controls felt sluggish, like I was flying through syrup. "Controls are heavy," Ramirez said. "Anyone else?" "Same here," Morales replied. His voice was shaking now. The craft began to ascend, moving gracefully, almost inviting us to follow. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to. It wasn't like the music was forcing me exactly, but it made the idea of turning away unthinkable. We climbed after it, the three of us, our jets struggling as if the air itself was resisting. The craft led us higher, past 40,000 feet, then 50,000. The stars seemed brighter, closer. My oxygen gauge flickered, and I realized how thin the air was getting. "We can't keep this up," Morales said. "We're going to stall out." The music shifted again, softer now, almost pleading. The craft stopped its climb, hovering in place. We leveled off, circling it at a cautious distance. "It's waiting for us," Ramirez said. "Waiting for what?" I asked. Before anyone could answer, the music surged, filling my head with images. Not pictures exactly, but impressions. Shapes, colors, emotions. A sense of distance, of loneliness, of searching. They weren't words, but they were clear. This thing, whatever it was trying to communicate. "It's not hostile," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "How do you know that?" Morales asked. "I just do," I said. "It's asking for something." The craft pulsed, its glow intensifying. The music shifted again, more urgent. Another wave of images flooded my mind. Earth from above, storms rolling across oceans, cities lighting up the night. and then darkness, silence. It was showing us what would happen if something wasn't done. "We need to respond," Ramirez said. "How?" Morales asked. "We don't even know what it wants." I didn't have an answer. None of us did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that turning away now would be wrong. I reached for the manual beacon override, a small device we used in emergencies to send out a distress signal. I activated it, broadcasting an unencrypted pulse. It was primitive, but it was all I could think to do. The craft reacted immediately. Its glow brightened and the music swelled, almost joyful. It began to ascend again, faster this time, pulling away from us. Within seconds it was gone, disappearing into the stars. The music faded with it, leaving only the hum of our engines and the vast, empty sky. "What just happened?" Morales asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we answered," I said. We returned to base in silence, none of us sure how to explain what we'd seen. The debrief was tense, the higher-ups skeptical, but the flight data backed us up. Whatever we'd encountered, it wasn't a malfunction or a trick of the mind. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it reached out to us. But I can't forget the music, or the sense that somehow we made a connection. Whatever it wasn't trying to hurt us. It was trying to reach us. I was stationed overseas doing communications work for the military, monitoring radio frequencies and satellite feeds from a secure facility buried deep underground. Most nights were routine, static, coded transmissions, the usual chatter you'd expect from various bases around the world. But there was one frequency we weren't supposed to acknowledge, one that appeared on our equipment but never officially existed. It started showing up about 3 months into my deployment. Channel 847.3 would light up on the display, but when you tuned into it there was nothing but silence. Not static, not interference. Pure, clean silence that felt wrong somehow. The senior officers told us to ignore it, said it was probably just a glitch in the system. But glitches don't maintain perfect clarity for hours at a time. The first time I heard something on that frequency, I thought I was losing my mind. It was around 0300 hours, and I was alone in the communications bay. The channel activated, showing a strong signal, and instead of silence, there was breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that didn't sound quite human. The rhythm was wrong. Too long between inhale and exhale, like whatever was breathing had lungs twice the size of ours. I called over Sergeant Martinez, but by the time he reached my station, the signal had cut out. He looked at me like I'd been staring at screens too long, told me to take a break, but I knew what I'd heard. That breathing was real, and it was coming from somewhere we couldn't track. Over the next few weeks, the transmissions became more frequent. Sometimes it was that same strange breathing. Other times it was clicks and tones arranged in patterns that almost sounded like language. The equipment showed the signals were incredibly strong, stronger than anything we received from our own satellites, but they never lasted more than a few minutes. Then one night, I heard words. They weren't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood them. Not the meaning exactly, but the intent behind them. It was like the voice was speaking directly to something deeper than my ears, bypassing language altogether and communicating through pure concept. The message was simple. They were listening to us, just as we were listening to them. I started keeping a log, documenting every transmission on 847.3. The patterns were too regular to be random interference. Every Tuesday at 03:15, every Friday at 01:40, and sometimes on Sundays around 2200. Whatever was sending these signals was following a schedule, like they had their own version of shift work. The breakthrough came when I realized the transmissions weren't just random. They were responding to our own communications. When we sent routine status updates to command, 847.3 would activate within minutes. When we tested our emergency frequencies, the breathing sounds would change tempo. They weren't just listening, they were analyzing, learning our protocols. I brought this to Martinez, showed him the logs I'd been keeping. His face went pale as he read through the patterns I'd documented. He told me to delete everything, said some things were above our clearance level. But he also started monitoring the frequency himself during his shifts. That's when we discovered we weren't the only ones receiving these signals. Martinez had contacts at other bases, and when he made some careful inquiries, he learned that facilities around the world were picking up similar transmissions. Always on frequencies that officially didn't exist, always with that same perfect clarity that our equipment couldn't explain. The night everything changed was a Thursday in November. I was monitoring the usual channels when 847.3 lit up with the strongest signal we'd ever recorded. But this time, instead of breathing or clicks, there was music, if you could call it that. It was like hearing a symphony played by instruments that didn't exist, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with human voices or machines. The music filled the communications bay, not just through the speakers but seeming to come from the walls themselves. Other operators started gathering around my station, drawn by sounds they could hear but couldn't locate. Everyone heard it, which meant this wasn't just in my head. Then the voice came through, speaking in perfect, unaccented English. "We have been listening to your world's communications for 73 of your years. We understand your languages, your concerns, your fears about contact with other civilizations. We are not here to cause alarm. We are here because your planet is approaching a transition, and you will need guidance." The voice paused, and in that silence, every piece of equipment in the facility hummed with an energy that made the air itself feel electric. Some of you have been chosen to serve as initial points of contact. You have been selected because you already listen professionally, because you understand the importance of clear communication across vast distances. We will continue to reach out through your frequencies. Do not fear these contacts. They are necessary. The transmission ended, and 847.3 went dark. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt like waiting. Command arrived within hours, confiscating all our logs and equipment from that shift. They debriefed each of us separately, asking the same questions over and over. What exactly did we hear? Who else knew about the frequency? Had we recorded anything? Their urgency told us this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I was transferred to a different base the following week, given a new assignment that had nothing to do with communications, but I still remember that voice, the certainty in its tone when it talked about transitions and guidance. Sometimes, late at night, I'll tune an old radio to random frequencies, wondering if 847.3 still exists somewhere in the spectrum. The strange thing is, ever since that night, I've been having dreams about vast ships moving between stars, about civilizations connected by networks of communication that span galaxies. In these dreams, I'm sitting at a console similar to the one I used in the military, but instead of monitoring Earth-based transmissions, I'm listening to conversations between worlds I've never seen. I don't know if those dreams are just my imagination or something more, but I do know that voice was right about one thing. We're not alone in listening to the universe. The question is whether we're ready to join the conversation that's been happening around us all along. As we reach the end of our journey through these extraordinary encounters, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a profound realization. Each story we've shared tonight has been a thread in a vast tapestry that stretches far beyond our understanding, connecting us to something immeasurably larger than ourselves. From the depths of Antarctic ice, where ancient vessels waited in patient slumber, to the endless expanse of space where pilots encountered intelligences that defied explanation. These accounts paint a picture of a universe teeming with consciousness. The radio operators who picked up signals from beyond our world, the researchers who uncovered treaties written in languages not of this earth, the ordinary people who found themselves chosen for extraordinary contact, all of them witnesses to the same fundamental truth. We are not alone. We have never been alone. The patterns emerge clearly when we step back and view these encounters as a whole. The consistent appearance of beings who demonstrate technology beyond our current understanding, yet who approach us not with conquest but with curiosity. The repeated instances of communication attempts, from mathematical sequences to musical transmissions that bypass language entirely. The careful observation, the gradual contact, the sense that we are being evaluated not as threats to be eliminated, but as a species in development. Consider the forest researcher who discovered roots connected to something vast and intelligent beneath the earth. Think of the mother who became a bridge between worlds, carrying within her a presence that sought only to understand human emotion and connection. Remember the violinist who learned melodies from beyond our reality, music that contained entire histories and cultures within its impossible notes. These encounters speak to a phenomenon that has been unfolding for generations, perhaps centuries. The evidence suggests a careful, methodical approach by intelligences who understand that true contact cannot be forced, but must be earned through trust, patience, and mutual respect. They appear to those who are ready, who can handle the profound shift in perspective that comes with knowing we are part of something infinitely larger. The lighthouse keeper who watched lights dance over the ocean in patterns too precise to be natural. The archaeologist who unearthed documents detailing ancient agreements between humanity and visitors from distant stars. The park ranger who felt the weight of observation from beings that existed just beyond the edge of perception. Each of these individuals was changed by their experience, carrying forward a knowledge that both humbled and elevated them. What strikes us most profoundly about these accounts is not the technology or the otherworldly nature of the encounters, but the underlying message of hope they contain. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, these stories speak to a cosmic perspective that transcends our earthly concerns. They remind us that consciousness, intelligence, and curiosity are not unique to our small planet, but are fundamental forces that unite all thinking beings across the vast reaches of space. The military personnel who encountered craft that could dance through our skies with impossible grace, yet chose to communicate rather than conquer. The scientists who detected signals that carried not threats but invitations to expand our understanding. The civilians who found themselves momentarily lifted out of their ordinary lives to glimpse the extraordinary reality that surrounds us all. Each story has been a gift, a window into experiences that challenge our most basic assumptions about reality, while simultaneously affirming our deepest hopes about our place in the universe. They tell us that we are watched over, that our development as a species is of interest to intelligences that have traveled unimaginable distances to observe our progress. Perhaps, most importantly, these encounters suggest that we are approaching a threshold. The frequency of sightings, the increasing boldness of contact, the growing number of people who carry these experiences within them, all point to a moment of transition approaching. Not the dramatic revelation of science fiction, but something more gradual, more organic. A slow awakening to the reality that has always surrounded us. The farmer who found perfect circles in his field, messages written in the language of the earth itself. The photographer whose camera captured more than he intended, revealing presence in the spaces between what we can see. The security guard who learned that protection comes not just from human vigilance, but from watchers who remain always just beyond our perception. These stories remind us that wonder still exists in our world, that mystery has not been conquered by technology or explained away by science. They invite us to look up at the night sky with new eyes, to see not just distant points of light but potential homes to consciousnesses that may already know of our existence. As you prepare for sleep tonight, carry with you the knowledge that you are part of a story larger than any single life, any single world. The universe pulses with intelligence and intention, and somewhere in that vast expanse, beings of wisdom and compassion are aware of our small blue planet and the remarkable species that calls it home. The encounters continue, the observations persist. The careful, patient work of contact proceeds at its own pace, guided by wisdom we are only beginning to comprehend. And perhaps, if we remain open to the possibilities that surround us, if we approach the unknown with courage rather than fear, we too may find ourselves touched by the profound experience of knowing we are truly not alone. Rest now in the comfort of this cosmic embrace, knowing that consciousness extends far beyond our world, and that we are part of a community of minds that spans the stars. The universe is vast, but it is not empty, it is not silent, and it is not indifferent to our presence within it. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers in this magnificent cosmic dance.